On Legacy Talk, we discussed legacy. We're called Legacy Talk, the Legacy Talk podcast, right? And the biggest thing about our estate plan, one of the biggest things, is think about this. What is our legacy? What is your legacy? We want to preserve our legacy, and that's not talking about just finance. I've got millions of dollars and I want to preserve that money for my family or charities or whatever. That's not what we're talking about, right? Who are we, right? That's where those core values come in. What do we think is important? What's important for us? What are our values? What are some stories that we want to carry on? What about family traditions like we've talked about? What about things like genealogy or family history that you might have that you want to have passed down to the generations, right? Potentially setting up things like tributes or memorials within your estate plan.
You are listening to the Legacy Talk podcast hosted by James A. Jones,
attorney at law and founder of Sound Legacy Law, PLLC in Tacoma.
Attorney Jones is here to talk about how to best protect your family, assets, and wealth, pulling stories from his more than 20 years of helping families and business owners protect their assets, create their estate plans, preserve their wealth, and plan for the future. Nobody wants to think about estate planning, but life has a way of sneaking up on you, and at any moment, something unexpected could happen that will leave you regretting not having acted sooner. So join Attorney James A. Jones in the Legacy Talk podcast, and together learn how to plan for your future today and have peace of mind tomorrow.
Welcome to Legacy Talk. I'm your host, James Jones. I'm an estate planning attorney in Tacoma, Washington. I've been practicing over 20 years, and my main practice areas are estate planning, probate, and estate and trust administration. On Legacy Talk, we discuss topics surrounding families and estates. Estate planning is often confusing and complicated, but my goal with this podcast is to make it understandable and accessible to those who really need it. So if this is something that interests you, I'd appreciate it if you would click the subscribe button and like this episode so that you can follow along with us as we break down the barriers of estate planning. I'm excited to get to today's topic. Today we're doing our first installment of the 10 Commandments of estate planning. This is a series that we'll be doing throughout the year, intermittently. The first topic, the first commandment, is envisioning your legacy, the art of long-term thinking, so that you know the importance of long-term thinking in your estate plan. So on today's show, we're talking about the first commandment of estate planning, envisioning your legacy, the art of long-term thinking. So let's get to it. So long-term thinking, that's a novel concept. We often can get so overcome by the needs of the world around us that we don't take a second to think about the future. The tyranny of the urgent beckons. If we let it, it can take away days and weeks and months and even years of our lives. When we let that happen and ignore long-term thinking and plans, we miss out on some of our sweetest moments. And in worst-case scenarios, we can fail ourselves and our families. So the reason we're talking about long-term thinking is not to make you feel bad, but to empower us to all create that roadmap forward. My particular part of that map is helping clients create a comprehensive estate plan. And that's where I come in this journey of long-term thinking. So I think about long-term thinking in a couple different ways. Have you ever set a goal and worked hard to accomplish it? I remember that when I was a student in college in particular, or any real level of academics, when you work to go toward a goal of successfully completing a course of study, or at least getting through one that's hard, that you're not maybe great at. I remember the feeling after my last semester, the last final of the last semester of a term or a semester, that feeling of relief. First, that the semester's over, but also that you've finished something that has taken so much time and energy and so much of your life. One of the last times that I felt this kind of relief was when I took the bar exam. In Washington State, when I took the bar, it was a 3-day long experience. When I took it, it was all handwritten essays, no multiple choice questions. That was a test that I studied for more than any other test in my life. I studied 8 hours a day for 6 days a week for over 2 months to prepare for that exam. I didn't want to have to take it more than once. Taking the test during the actual exam, you're nervous, you're worried, sick, emotional. But once I finish, I remember that feeling of relief and joy and satisfaction and accomplishment. But it wasn't easy to do that. And I remember driving home. It was a beautiful day in July from that test, which was in Bellevue, after living in a motel for 3 days away from my family, which consisted of my wife and my young 1-year-old almost daughter. And I had the biggest smile on my face when I finished that. And I chased that feeling, that relief, that satisfaction, that joy that you get when you accomplish something or do something that you've worked hard on that really will impact your life. Because from that point, you're in law school or you're in college or whatever, right? And you're thinking, well, what does this have to do with me getting a job later? What if I can't do what I'm studying, right? What if this was all for naught? I can't pass that test or something like that. Thankfully, that didn't come true for me. I passed on the first try. But you're not sure, and you've studied hard, right? It's like that for anything, right? Any course of study, any goal that you're undertaking, that's something that's taken a lot of thought and a lot of dedication. And that feeling of joy is deserved. That relief is deserved. And that's that kind of a feeling, maybe not exactly as profound a feeling, but that kind of feeling can come when you've completed an estate plan as well. And the reason why, there's a couple of reasons why. You're protecting your family. You're thinking, yeah, my kids will be okay, right? You did it, right? You got that feeling. No more procrastinating. My kids will live with someone that I choose. My hard-earned dollar will go to someone or towards something that I want it to go to. The state's not going to tell me where my stuff goes. I did an adult thing today. That's the thing, right? I checked that nagging box on my to-do list. So, in the context of estate planning, long-term thinking is important, okay? And like I mentioned, the tyranny of the urgent captures us, and it can take us hostage. And if we let that run our lives, we're not going to accomplish what we could accomplish. We're not going to make the plans that we should make. And I think that if that's the way we're living, we're missing out, right? Like I mentioned before. And so in the context of estate planning, there's a few things that we want to think about with long-term thinking. And, and I'll say this to start. If you haven't got anything in your estate or any planning done, don't wait till you've had years and months and decades or whatever to put your plans in place. Something is better than nothing. So because you haven't thought about this for years or decades or months or whatever period of time you want to use, it shouldn't be a barrier to entry into getting something down that, at least as far as you can tell, accomplishes your goals. Okay? So this kind of a discussion is, well, these are some things to think about in an estate plan, but it doesn't mean that you've got to think about this for those periods of time that we've mentioned, like quantity-wise, right? You don't have to think about it for a year or 10 years or 5 years or 6 months, right? You don't have to think about it that long to get something down that works. But it is something you want to think about. It's something that you want to take seriously. So you want to create, first of all, we want to create a comprehensive plan. And we want to look beyond the immediate needs of an estate plan. We want to think about life events for ourselves and our kids. What happens when our kids get married? What happens when we have grandkids? What happens if we have another kid late in life? What happens if I'm sick and I can't take care of myself and I need to go into a long-term care situation? Those types of things can significantly impact an estate plan. And so that's the kind of thing you want to think about when you're making a comprehensive plan, because that comprehensive plan will deal with these various scenarios, and so that this plan, if these kinds of things come into play, this plan can address them, okay, and take care of them. You want to think about family dynamics, right? Changes in relationship, divorces, estrangements. We've talked about that before and how that can impact an estate plan. And you want to have your plan be able to adapt to those kinds of situations. What happens if your kids get divorced? Do we want to think about what happens with the money that they might inherit from you that you've worked hard for? Do you want that to be part of a divorce proceeding? We can make plans for that. And then you want to make sure that your plan stays current with the laws as they change. And like I've mentioned before multiple times on this podcast, the estate planning laws change, particularly with regard to the estate tax. So we want to make sure that our plan is amendable. It's variable in a way that if something changes, we can pivot, right? We can pivot with that change, because it seems to change every time it changes in this country, depending on who's elected as president. Another thing to think about in this long-term planning, long-term thinking scenario is what our core values are for our family. Who are we? What do we believe, right? How do we want our kids to be raised? How do we want to make sure that our kids aren't affected in a negative way by the money that they might inherit from us? And so you can put in provisions in an estate plan which either limits or guides beneficiaries in how they use money. It incentivizes work, or it can. It could incentivize schooling or apprenticeship programs, things like that. And it can reward kids and beneficiaries for positive things that they've done in their life, okay? Like getting married or buying a house, right? Or going to college, like we said, doing a work-study style program, a trade program. We want to put that kind of thing in the estate plan, right? We want to think about that. We want to also think about family traditions. You know, if we have a cabin, for example, how do we deal with that and make sure that that cabin can be used down generationally for our kids and our grandkids and our great-grandkids? How can we set up our plan so that cabin and its ownership doesn't get so convoluted and diluted that it's impossible to keep and everybody hates each other? That's something to think about, right? And you can use assets and you can use planning to sustain these types of traditions, okay? And you can also promote long-term goals. I come from a family of high achievers. I'm the youngest of 5 kids. I am the only non-medical person in my family. And, a brother that's a neurosurgeon. I've got a brother that's an anesthesiologist. I've got a sister who's an extremely talented artist who is trained as a nurse. And her husband happens to be an anesthesiologist. And then I have a veterinarian by training brother who's also a naturopath and herbalist, entrepreneur, and I'm the lawyer, right? I always said that I underachieve at high levels as the youngest kid. But I think I'm doing okay, I guess. But you want to think about that. So my family, I had a long tradition, lots of schooling, as you can imagine. And so that was sort of built into our culture in our home. My dad was a PhD. And so we sort of built that in. And that was kind of part of our legacy, that we're well educated, we're professionals, we want to be able to work for ourselves, we want to be able to work hard and help people. Okay? And that's where it comes from. We want to be able to help people, and we want to be able to be self-sufficient. So that was part of our tradition that was ingrained in the family. And that kind of thing can be put into an estate plan as well, right? That, hey, if you get to go to grad school or if you get to go to college, you're going to be rewarded for that, right? We're going to pay for it. We may give you more access to funds if you do a graduate program or something like that. So think about that. You also want to think about estate plan, long generational impact. If you think about it, if you save well, and, most of my clients, if most people in Washington State, which is where I practice, who have had at least a mid-level job, steady job with a reputable company or a good company that helps with their pension, helps with a 401k or savings plan like that, has a good amount of money in that plan. And they're good savers, right? And our home values in Washington are very high. So if you've had your house and you've paid it off or paid it down, probably there's a good chance you've got a lot of equity to deal with. And so, most of my clients are probably making, having estates over $2 million, $3 million, $4 million. And that's just based on home values and saving and investing well and those kinds of things, right? They don't act like millionaires. They just happen to have done well saving wise. And if you think about it, when those types of people retire, or even if you retire with $1 million or $2 million or something like that, which you may think, well, that's not that much. I'm going to spend every last cent in retirement. In reality, in the vast majority of cases, unless there's like a long-term care situation where someone has dementia and they have to be in a long-term care facility or something, those people don't spend all that money. And so that money goes to the kids, right? Sometimes it goes to the grandkids. And that might be a lot of money, okay? And so if you do it right and you create an estate plan which considers the generations after you, including your kids and your grandkids and great grandkids even, you can create that generational wealth through a comprehensive plan, okay? And that could be a lot of money. And so we want to think about the positives, like, well, this could make it so that they could run businesses, they could make investments, they could be completely self-sufficient, right? But it also could make them completely reliant on trust, become trust fund kids or something like that. Even if it's only maybe they inherit a few $100,000, they can become a trust fund kid. And we don't want that, right? So those are things to think about with that generational mindset and the impact that an estate plan might have on future generations. And then, like I mentioned before, with estate taxes changing all the time, we want to make sure that our plan varies and pivots and that we can address those potential changes in the tax law, estate taxes primarily, before they become problems and negatively impact our estate. We want to maximize our exemptions for that estate tax. In Washington State, we have a very low estate tax exemption, which is about $2.193 million as we speak today, which is relatively low, like I said, where we have people that have saved money and they've got high value houses, even though they might not have paid what the house is worth now. It's worth a lot now, right? And so we want to make sure that we're maximizing exemptions so that we're not paying more in taxes than we have to. And that's something that we want to integrate in there. And we want to consider life changes too. We want to be flexible, right? That's another thing to think about. In our long-term thinking, flexibility is important. And I think we've gone through that, like pivoting for estate taxes. What happens if a child of mine gets divorced or something? What happens if they become disabled down the road? What happens if I have a disabled grandchild that might have special needs that I need to address? Those kinds of things, and being flexible in your estate plan are significantly important, okay? We want to have contingency plans that say, well, if this happens, I want to make sure that my plan can cover that, right? If I'm incapacitated, does my plan cover that? If I become, if I lose money in the stock market, I lose everything, what happens then? Those are kinds of things to think about in that long-term plan. And that flexibility, I think, really brings peace of mind, and it mitigates potential challenges that come down the road. And we want to make sure that our plan, while flexible, we have to have it structured in a way that it's not like liquid through your fingers, I guess you'd want to say. We want to have it be robust and have a structure that says, well, if this is the situation, this is what happens. We don't want to give someone too much authority to make changes or make interpretations later. We want to put clear parameters on our plan and put in contingencies that may or may not have to be dealt with, but we don't want to give some one or two people, like a trustee or an executor, too much authority to interpret and distribute according to their whims. Yeah, we want to make sure that's dialed in, okay, and detailed. We want to talk about business succession planning. If we have a business that we've built over the years, what happens if we don't adequately address that? What happens if you are not there to run that business anymore? Do we sell the business? Can we sell it? Do we have things like life insurance to buy out or allow you to be bought out, or your wife to be bought out, or your husband, whoever's the deceased spouse, or your kids. We want to make sure that business, if it could run without you, will, right? If you have a child that might work in the business with you, how do we deal with that child without making the others jealous or frustrated? We want to identify that successor who can continue that business on, right? And encourage our children or whoever works with us to sort of take that proactive goal, right? Maybe they want to be taken under your wing in a mentorship kind of role and gradually transition into that succession plan. And that kind of thing really helps to avoid conflicts and makes this transition and the turnover a much more seamless process. We want to talk about potential conflicts with that. Do we compensate the other kids with other kinds of assets versus the business? So those are kinds of things to think about. The other thing to think about when we're talking long-term thinking and our estate plan is charitable giving. A lot of you like to give to charity, right? America, the United States of America is the most charitable nation typically in the world. We are charitable people, right? We like to give to charity, and there's benefits to do that, right? There's benefits because it makes you feel good. You're helping people. You're helping causes that you want to support. And you also get a tax write-off. Like, coming from an estate planning standpoint, we want to talk about the benefits from a tax standpoint of charitable giving. So that kind of philanthropic vision that you might have is something that you want to have in your estate plan. I know that a lot of my clients have charitable aspirations as far as a portion of their estate or their assets. And so we build that kind of thing in estate plans all the time, as far as which charities benefit, right? You can also use things like private foundations or donor advised funds, and things like that become part of an estate plan where the charitable vision that you have is really focused on a group of charities that you really want to support. And so that's very important to have in an estate plan. And you want to be able to sustain that giving potentially when you're gone, right? I've had clients indicate that their children are required in a trust setting to provide a percentage of that income from the trust to charity. And that the benefit of that is, one, charitable giving is good, makes you feel good. Two, it helps beneficiary or children to understand where their parents might be coming from as far as their charitable giving. And so it's something to consider. And finally, on Legacy Talk, we discussed legacy. We're called Legacy Talk, the Legacy Talk podcast, right? And the biggest thing about our estate plan, one of the biggest things, is think about this. What is our legacy? What is your legacy? We want to preserve our legacy, and that's not talking about just finance. I've got millions of dollars and I want to preserve that money for my family or charities or whatever. That's not what we're talking about, right? Who are we, right? That's where those core values come in. What do we think is important? What's important for us? What are our values? What are some stories that we want to carry on? What about family traditions like we've talked about? What about things like genealogy or family history that you might have that you want to have passed down to the generations, right? Potentially setting up things like tributes or memorials within your estate plan to recognize people, right, that have impacted your life. Sometimes people will include a beneficiary in their plan who has helped them along the way, right? A mentor or a mentee, right? A good friend that might have helped through tough times. Those kinds of bequests and notes and beneficiary designations in an estate plan can really help preserve your legacy. And so we want to think about how we want to be remembered. You know, what kind of meaningful gestures can we make and incorporate into our estate plan to leave a lasting impression on people? You know, we're not here necessarily to become millionaires, right? I think we're here to help people, right? We're here to become better people. We're here to become more than we are, more than we think we can be, if that makes sense. And so when we're thinking about our legacy, you know, Who is that person? Okay. Think about it. So I always have a story. In each episode has a story time. And so story time today is about a married couple, a family, and the theme of the story is don't wait until it's too late to plan, right? I have a client, or had a client, whose husband was battling cancer. And, when I first met with them, he was still feeling really good. He had been diagnosed for a while, but he wasn't in a super aggressive state of his cancer. And I met with him and his wife, and we came up with a comprehensive estate plan. Their estate consisted of rental properties, and they also had a small business where some of the family members worked, some of their kids worked, but not all of their kids, right? Not all of their kids worked there. So that was an issue. And we created a plan, okay? We talked about this plan for those situations. If they weren't around to run the business, who would run it, who would get it? How do we offset distributions to the other kids? And we prepared all the documents for them. And right before, we had scheduled a meeting to sign the documents, right? We scheduled the meeting. It's all ready to go. We get a call the day before. We always confirm our appointments. My husband's in the hospital. And we're thinking, we know what's going on. We know he's got cancer. And this is also during the COVID-19 pandemic. And so that's another issue. And this is an older guy, right? This is an older couple in their early 70s. And during COVID, they weren't letting a lot of people in the hospitals, of course. But they were letting lawyers in. We're letting lawyers in because we, particularly estate planning lawyers, because we help people get stuff signed that they needed signed in case something happened to them. And so my staff and I offered to go to the hospital. Hey, we can come out. It's no big deal. We'll get everything signed. Don't worry about it. Okay. And his wife said, no, we'll be out soon. He'll be out soon. We'll be back in the office as soon as he's out. Okay. And so a week or two passed, and we're thinking, hey, we better follow up with those guys. What's going on? How's he doing? And he was still there, still in the hospital, and we're saying, the offer still stands. I can show up over there at the hospital. We can sign everything, and everything's in place, and you don't have to worry. No, we'll be out soon, and we'll be in the office to sign everything soon. And you can probably figure out the ending of this story, right? My client's husband died in the hospital without signing any of the documents. And what happened with that estate and that family is there was a messy probate. There were kids from out of state trying to take control. There was discord among the family with regard to the business. The wife really didn't know anything about any of the business or the real estate. It was all always done by her husband. And so she was at a significant disadvantage. A messy probate, like I said, was the result. Okay. And family disharmony. And so, had they executed the plan, they thought, I guess the moral of the story is they thought they had done it, right? They were thinking ahead. We're going to get this done. We're going to plan for this and that and this contingency and that. That moment, right? When you're stuck in the moment and you can't get past the feeling that you don't want to think about the future because the future feels bad, right? Because the future might be a future without my husband. It might be a future my husband having died from cancer that he's been fighting, right? And you don't place blame on that, right? It's hard when that's the situation, and it's hard to overcome that emotion and that reluctance to think about those things, even though it makes the most sense and it's logical. We're not always logical in that situation. And so you don't place blame, but I think, that comes back to the tyranny of the urgent and only thinking about now and not thinking about tomorrow, right? And so that's the story. That's the story for this episode. It's a sad story. They're not always sad, but I think that one's sad because it didn't turn out great. We got to think ahead. We can't delay. we got to take the time to focus on things that are important despite how they make us feel, right? I've said this before on this podcast that death is part of life, right? It's not something that we really should avoid thinking about. And we need to think about our future and our families and our legacy. And that's why we have this podcast. We're building awareness because it's so important to make sure that you're protected and your family's protected and your legacy's protected. And so that's it. That's today's episode 5. I thank you for listening to today's episode of Legacy Talk. If you liked today's episode and would like to learn more, please like and subscribe for more great content. We're trying to put these out every week, and so we're really doing our best to get those published. And we thank you for listening. I've been your host, James Jones. To your legacy.
Thank you for listening to the Legacy Talk podcast by attorney James A. Jones. If you found today's episode helpful, we ask that you like and follow us on all major platforms so you don't miss out on the latest episode. If you have questions for Attorney Jones, reach out at info@joneslegacylaw.com or visit our website at joneslegacylaw.com. Join us again next week for another episode of the Legacy Talk podcast.